everybody, it's Courtney here with another design team project for Simon Hurley Create. Today I'm going to be using the Dudes 2 stamp set as well as the Painted Lines background stamp. We're going to be using the Remember Me and Clear Skies dye ink by Simon Hurley as well. I have a piece of Inkadinkado masking paper here that I cut with a oval die, and you can use any oval die or any shape that you want. I'm going to go ahead and start out with my stamping, and I am using my MISTI for this. I find that that is the easiest. I added a little bit of Tombow Mono Multi Glue and smeared that to the back of my card panel before sticking that down into my MISTI. I did let this dry for a minute or two so that it's repositionable. My card panel is not going to move around as I'm doing my stamping. You definitely want your card panel to be in one place when you're doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and start by laying down my masking paper here, just leaving that oval in the center. Now you can see that my masking paper is torn a little bit. That's okay for this technique. It's not going to really matter as long as you make sure that it's nice and smooth, or as smooth as you can possibly get it, to your card panel. I want to go ahead and stamp out this little guy here, or this little dude, kind of peeking out through this fake little window, I guess, that we're kind of creating here. And I don't want to move my card panel because it's in a position where I want it to do my stamping with my background stamp, and I don't have that foam insert in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and stamp these with an acrylic block. I am stamping these with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I started off with his little body, and in the stamp set there's a couple different bodies you can choose from and a couple different faces that you can choose from. So I went ahead and stamped his face, and you could see that a little bit of him is beyond that masking, but that's okay. We'll fix that in just a minute. Going to go ahead and stamp these onto another piece of masking paper, and I fussy cut these out, and then I will go ahead and mask his little body as well as his little face. You will want to make sure that you leave the mask for his face in place, especially being I stamped beyond the masking. If you didn't do that, if you stamped the right way, you wouldn't have to worry about it. So make sure that you're using a masking paper that's tacky enough to kind of stick and be reused. So I'm going to go ahead and line up my cling stamp here, my background stamp, close my MISTI door, and I'm going to be bringing out the Clear Skies ink. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp that out just obviously in the center, in that little opening there. And this is the lighter of the two blues that I'm going to be using. Go ahead and clean off my stamp here, and without moving my card panel, I want to do a little bit of ink blending. So I'm going to use that same ink and a blending brush, and I'm tapping off on a scrap piece of paper here because I don't want too much ink going on here. I just want to add a little bit of color to the background. So I'm starting right on that masking paper and kind of moving my way inside of that little oval. Once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and remove that large piece of masking paper that is covering most of our background there, and the mask for his little body, again, keeping that mask for his face in place. I did take a Copic safe pen just to draw in the rest of his little hair there, and all I really did was trace along the masking paper. It made it nice and easy to make sure that it was actually the right shape, because even that little tiny bit of his hair that's showing, I probably couldn't draw in freehand. So I went ahead and lined up the other mask here, the actual oval, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp out with that same stamp without moving the panel, without moving the stamp, for the other blue, which is the Remember Me, which is a little bit darker. It's more of a turquoise or tealish blue. And I did stamp this twice just to make sure that I get a really good impression. Then I will go ahead and remove my panel there, but keep that mask in place. I want to do a little bit of ink blending on the rest of the background. Again, I'm going to take out my blending brush here, tapping off on my scrap piece of paper. And I'm starting off with the corners and working my way towards that oval in the center, but I'm not going all the way to it. So I'm leaving kind of like a little halo or a little outline, I guess, around that oval. So I just want the color to basically be on the outside, and this will help differentiate between the card panel itself and that little oval opening that we're kind of creating. I guess it's not really an opening, but the oval shape, I should say. So once my ink blending was done, I did go ahead and remove the oval and then realized I didn't want to do that yet. So I had to try to line this up the best I could, and having the stripes really helped because all I had to do was really line up the stripes. And I'm going to take a Copic safe pen, but you can use any pen here, being we're not using Copic markers in this area. And I'm going to go ahead and trace around that masking paper. Now it's not perfect, being I've removed it. It's kind of not laying all that flat, but being the background stamp is that painted lines and it's not perfect, I'm okay with this not being perfect as well. So I went ahead and removed all of my masks and just touched up some of those areas with that EK Success journaling pen. And then we are going to move on to the Copic coloring. Going to start off with his skin tones here, and this is the skin tone combination that I use most often. Going to start off with that lightest color, the E50, just to map out the darkest areas, which will pretty much be underneath his hair and then a little bit off to the left-hand side, being he's kind of facing that way a little bit. I also added a little bit of shading under his nose, on top of his nose, around his neck, because that would be more of a rounder object, and on the bottom portion of his arm, also a teeny tiny bit on the inside of his ears. So my darkest color was the E04, and then moving on to the darkest midtone, which is the E11, extending those areas out even further. Then the E01, doing the same thing and just leaving a little bit of a highlight off to the right-hand side for his face, and the middle for his neck, and on the top portion of his arm. Once the skin tones were done, we're going to move on to his hair, and I like to start directly with the darkest color for hair and kind of maintain those flick lines. It just gives a little added texture to the hair. Going to put a little bit of shading on his little sideburns there, up and down, just using the tip of my marker, barely touching the paper here. For the top portion of his hair, I'm going to add a little bit of shading on both sides. You can see that I'm varying the lengths of my flick lines, and this will add a little bit of texture to his hair as well. I'm also going along with the shape of his hair, so it's more of a round on the outside, so my flicks will be a little bit more rounded as I get to the edges. Did the same thing with the E57, being careful not to overblend. A lot of people struggle with hair because they're overblending. So just go in with your flick lines and move on. Even with your lightest color, go very, very quickly and leave it as is, and you'll maintain that texture. The more times you go over the area with any of the colors, the more you're going to blend it, and you're going to kind of get a muddy look. So once his hair was done, I'm going to move on to his little jeans here, bringing out my my B90 markers, starting off with the lightest color to get the paper saturated a little bit, then moving on to the darkest, which is the B97, just adding a little bit of shading to the inside of his pockets. Those would naturally be darker, and then just on the inside of his pants. Blending that out with the B95 a little bit further than the B93, and then I'll move back on into the B91 for just the highlight area. Now for his shirt, I wanted this to be really bright, being most of the card isn't. So I decided to use a yellow combination, and this combination is actually new to me. I've seen a lot of people use it, so I wanted to give it a try, and I recently just picked up the E99 marker. So I'm adding that as my darkest color, and this is obviously more of a brown color. Don't be afraid when you're coloring something yellow to do your shading with either a brown or an orange. I know that sounds a little bit weird, especially with the brown, but you'll notice that you'll get a lot more contrast. Yellows are very difficult, and if you just stick to straight yellows, you're really not going to get the contrast you may be looking for. But for his shirt, I just added a little bit of shading on the bottom portion of his sleeves, underneath his little, I guess it would be a collar, and then on either side, just pretty much keeping a center highlight. For his little tongue there, I'm only going to use two different colors here. I'm going to bring out the R24 for the back, or the furthest back from us, I guess you could say, and then blend that out a little bit with the R22. Now, being I stamped this with an acrylic block and not my Misty or stamp positioner, the inside of his mouth is a little bit blotchy and it should be solid. So I'm just going to go in with my black marker, the 100 marker, just to fill in that area, just to make it a little bit more solid. Now, at this point, I hate this card. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this down using a large stitched rectangle die by Simon Says Stamp. You can use any shape here, just because I wanted to add a little bit something to it. I guess when I had this idea in my mind, it looked a lot different. So I'm hoping that at this point, with the sentiment and trimming this down, it'll work. So I tested the area out with some embossing powder to make sure that ink blending was dry. It was not, so I gave it another 10 minutes or so to make sure it was completely dry. Otherwise, you're going to have embossing powder stick to areas you don't want it to. Bringing back out my mini Misty here, and I'm going to stamp out this dude with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a pigment ink. It stays wet enough, long enough to emboss with it. So I treated my panel with my anti-static tool. I did go ahead and stamp out this sentiment twice just to make sure it was nice and bold. Now I do have that adhesive on the back of my panel, which is why you'll continue to see this stick to everything that I'm working on. My work surface, scrap pieces of paper, everything. So I sprinkled on some clear embossing powder here and heat set this, making sure that my heat gun was heated up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper. I'm going to take a scrap piece of black cardstock here, treated that with my anti-static tool. Next, I'm stamping the rest of the sentiment with Versamark ink and then sprinkling on white embossing powder this time. Once again, I heat set that, and then I will trim this down into a pretty skinny little sentiment strip that will go below that big dude. So I also have a piece of black cardstock here that is just a little bit larger than my card panel, but a little bit smaller than my card base, just to kind of frame this in. This, I find, really makes your card panel pop off the page just by adding just a little bit of a black border around it. So I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to adhere my panel to that black cardstock and then onto a white top folding A2 size note card, trimming this sentiment strip down at an angle on one side, and then I will add some of my foam tape here to the back of that and pop that up directly on the bottom, pretty much centered, or as centered as I can get it anyway. And just to add a little bit of texture, for his glasses, I'm going to bring in some glossy accents. I squirt this onto a little scrap piece of paper there just to make sure there's no air bubbles, and then I'll go ahead and fill in his glasses, and this will dry completely clear. And that's it. That is the card for today. As always, I'll leave the supplies listed below. Thanks, guys. Bye.